Welcome to The Red Notes. Today's episode is about F is for family, specifically Frank Murphy, his relationship with his father, himself, and his children, specifically his son. Frank Murphy isn't a good father, but he deeply tries and wants to be. He's definitely not a bad man. He wants to be good. He wants to be the kind of father who protects and guides his kids. But Frank's emotional toolbox is empty. Raised by Big Bill, a man whose love was quoted in shouts, screams, and cruelty, Frank learned that being a father meant being tough, unyielding, and even distant. He only knows how to communicate through yelling orders and just being abusive. His parenting failures all stem from his warped perspective. He crushes Kevin's rock star dreams because he genuinely believes he's protecting him from failure and addiction. He ignores Bill's emotional needs because he thinks giving him space is showing him trust. He discourages Maureen's intellectualism because he watched Sue get chewed up by the corporate world and wants to spare his daughter from that pain. Genuinely, he wants to be good and wants to protect his children from the world that surrounds them. I personally think that this Reddit post does a great job of breaking down exactly what I mean and why I think Frank is a flawed father. Not necessarily a bad father, but a father who tries to be good, but sadly ends up causing a lot of harm. It really goes into depth about a lot of the actions of Frank and why exactly he's flawed. So if you guys want to take a quick pause just to read what this Reddit post is saying, please go ahead and do so. But I'm going to continue with my video now. The tragedy of Frank Murphy is that every horrible thing he does comes from a place of love, or at least the closest approximation of love that a man raised by Big Bill could possibly understand. He's trapped in a cycle where good intentions keep curdling into abuse, because the one thing his father never taught him is how to actually connect with his kids. When Kevin gets arrested for robbing a liquor store, Frank responds with fury, not concern, not empathy, just punishment. It's his default setting. To Frank, yelling is parenting, and anything softer is weakness. Sue, as usual, plays the role of the emotional translator. She tries to de-escalate and soften the impact, but Frank is too angry to listen. And what's worse, he's scared, because he sees himself in Kevin, and he sees Kevin walking through the same miserable life he had. So Frank tries to do something different. He decides that he's going to try to have a heart-to-heart with Kevin. Frank hopes that this will give Kevin some form of clarity and in turn bring them closer to one another. Frank tells the story of when he was a kid and how he was excited to perform in a school play and he wanted his father, Big Bill, to be proud. But instead of clapping, Big Bill laughed at him, loudly and publicly. And the worst thing is, the audience joined in. Frank froze on stage, humiliated, and afterwards, Big Bill berated him and refused to drive him home. Instead, crawling behind his son in the car, mocking him for hours. And then for a whole year, called Frank Francine. Although I'm not trying to excuse Big Bill's actions, I think he's clearly a product of his time. In the 1940s and 50s, especially in working class America, masculinity was tightly policed. Men were supposed to be tough, silent, emotionally detached. They weren't supposed to show vulnerability, creativity, or sensitivity, traits often dismissed as weak or worse, feminine. So when a young Frank gets on stage to perform in a school play, he isn't just doing something joyful, he's stepping outside the rigid mold of manhood his father believes in. And rather than appreciating his son's courage or his imagination, Big Bill feels threatened. He mocks Frank not because he's ashamed of him, but because he's afraid. Afraid that Frank will grow up to be different. Afraid that softness means failure. In Big Bill's world, boys don't perform. They fought. They worked, they toughened up. So he doesn't care. He laughs. He tears his son down in front of a crowd and then punishes him for being humiliated. Not because Frank deserved it, but because Big Bill thought that was the only way to make a man out of his son. And so the cycle begins. Frank learns that joy is dangerous, that tenderness gets you laughed at, that love is conditional, and decades later, Frank raises his own son in the shadow of that lesson, believing that constantly yelling is a valid form of parenting and that mockery builds character and that affection is a luxury that you simply cannot afford. It's in this moment while Frank opens up, hoping to connect with Kevin, that Kevin in fact falls asleep. And when he wakes up, they argue again. No resolution, no breakthrough, just another failed attempt at connection. Frank poured a lot of emotion into his speech, clearly trying to sympathize and have a heart-to-heart with his son. But Kevin sleeping through it undermined the connection they could have had. Later, Kevin mentions a childhood memory where Frank abandoned him on the beach. Frank insists that what he did wasn't abandonment, he just went to get a beer. But Kevin only remembers being alone, just like Frank remembers being alone. Even the joke of calling Kevin the accident for years, a joke that Frank thinks is meaningless and fun, is just another echo of Big Bill calling him Francine. Pain gets passed down, repackages humor, and nobody laughs. Frank swore never to become like his father, but actually became his father. Personally, I believe that if you're making a joke about someone and you believe that it is all fun, then you should be fine with someone else making a similar joke to you. And if the person you're joking about is supposedly someone you care about and they're telling you that they are hurt by your jokes, then it only makes sense for the jokes to stop. Because at the end of the day, you're hurting someone and it can be traumatic and scar them for life. Bill gets home around the same time while Kevin and Frank are arguing. And it's clear that Bill is quite tired, dislikes attention in his family, and just wants to come home to peace. In addition to this, he needs help and tries to ask Frank for help with his situation. But rather than acknowledging that his son needs him, Frank chooses to dismiss Bill because he is still having a one-sided heart-to-heart with Kevin, which is just a screaming match. While this was going on, Sue and Maureen were at the TV Kids clown game show, the Hobo Dojo show. The game show is actually a fraud, and Maureen is cheated out of her win. Although she is unhappy about this situation, she holds hope in one thing, that Frank would have been watching the whole thing. But he didn't. This hurts her because she believed that he would hold on to this promise. When she finds out that he didn't, she basically breaks down and agrees with Kevin that Frank does not care about her because he only cares about the new baby coming soon. Mind you, Sue is pregnant. While this is going on, Bill had packed and ran away with his girlfriend, emphasizing the family, especially Frank, did not have to worry because they did not care about him anyways. He specifically apologized and emphasizes that he will no longer be bothering Frank with his problems, apologizing for being a disappointment and being weak. Although I could go more into the dynamics and what happened episodes later or following this, I'm just going to skip to a later time where Bill is back and the family found them and they brought Bill and Bridget back home. So let's fast forward to the future. Frank goes to a confessional, and this episode is season 4, episode 1. He breaks down and basically says that he deserves to be in hell. Pretty dramatic. He confesses to the priest that his father had come back. Frank talks about his childhood, and we learn that Big Bill was once the golden man of Rustville. Charming, successful, beloved by the public. But behind closed doors, he was cruel and volatile. Frank never got praised, only beatings and humiliation. And he desperately looked up to his father. In 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk created an effective polio vaccine, so Big Bill's career basically collapsed after he invested a ton of money, basically all of his money, into polio wellness equipment, but they found a cure literally the same year, so he went bankrupt. So he lost his reputation and wealth. He began to excessively drink. I mean, he was already a drinker, but he started drinking even more, and he started to take everything out on his family. This episode, I think, is one of my favorite episodes, and I think that if you've never seen F is for Family, at least go check out this specific episode, just to get an idea of the dynamics and the background of Frank and why he is the way that he is and why he thinks that his parenting style is valid even though it's also problematic. Big Bill and teenage Frank get into an argument where Big Bill ends up beating his son. Nora, Frank's mother, walks in and tries to stop the abuse. She asks what kind of father takes out his failures on his son, and he utters, "Every man in America," as if abuse was part of the dad job description. Nora and Big Bill start to fall apart, and sometime later, he leaves the home never to come back. While leaving, he utters a sly remark at Frank, reserves, mocking him for his placement in the army. Just to give a quick refresher, as soon as Frank turned 18, he basically decided to enlist in the army, but he was put in reserves, which I guess Big Bill sees as lesser because I believe Big Bill would have been raised during maybe World War I. So he probably fought, was drafted, so he got to see, I guess, real war, quote unquote. So he mocks his son for being in the reserves because it's not manly or army enough. Army shaming needs to stop. Basically, fast forward to the present, 18 years later, Big Bill is back. Frank still has a lot of trauma from his childhood and seems to want nothing to do with his father, but deep down, he feels neglected and wishes that his father would say that he was proud of him for once. Frank gets the opportunity to see his father again when his father's job brings him to Frank's neighborhood, and Frank goes outside to meet his father, and he is surprised that his father has shrunken, and just all types of weird dynamics, and you can clearly see that they don't like each other. But one thing that I also found that stuck out was the fact that Frank's children called Big Bill Mr. Murphy, and he quickly tried to dismiss and distance himself from Mr. Murphy, which was the name that Frank's grandfather was named. So Big Bill's father was named Mr. Murphy, and we can assume that he was also probably deeply abusive because of the fact that Big Bill wants to distance his name from the name of Mr. Murphy. So long story short, there's just a cycle of generational abuse. I think this also makes a lot of sense because Big Bill struggles to see the errors of his ways because he views his father as even worse. So by him being slightly better, he thinks he's done a good job of being a father. But I think it's basically comparing a landfill to large trash cans. But the truth is they both still house garbage and they both still need to be taken out. So just putting that out there. Big Bill does a great job of helping around the house. He basically moves into the house, so he helps out around the house a lot. And he remembers a lot of the kids' birthdays and names and does things that Frank doesn't do for the kids. And that surprises Frank because he is upset because his father, he doesn't even think his father remembers his birthday, but he remembers his kids' birthdays. He's kind of distraught about that. So Big Bill was here for his company or whatnot, but he ended up staying much longer than expected. And everyone but Frank wants him to stay longer and is happy to have him. One moment that I quickly want to pinpoint to is the scene where Bill accidentally spills some of his drink onto the table and Frank explodes and starts to yell at Bill, and Big Bill interrupts and basically tells him to calm down and that he's literally just a kid. Like, why are you yelling at a kid? And this leads to Frank basically spiraling because throughout his childhood he got beaten for any little thing. And there's literally also a scene of Frank spilling something during the dinner and Big Bill just exploding on him. But now he's over here playing the good grandfather to Bill and the other kids. Frank confesses that the endless taunting and bullying that he endured when he was a kid hurt his feelings, but no one at the table or the dinner table seemed to want to acknowledge anything because I guess they kind of think their father or slash husband is dramatic. But I think one thing that Frank doesn't realize is that he's unconsciously repeated the cycle to an extent. He's yelling at his son for doing something that he did when he was younger and that he hated being beat or bullied for. Now he's doing that same exact thing to his kid. It's just troubling. The dinner scene ends up being just a conversation, kind of an argument of Frank trying to get the family to be on his side and saying that Big Bill has been such a horrible father and that everyone should be on his side. But Bill tries to reason with Frank, highlighting how Frank had in fact promised to do things as well and promised to be a good father as well and ended up not being exactly that. Frank decides to yell at Bill and tell him to stop living in the past. But the funny thing is, it's quite hypocritical because all he has done throughout this dinner scene is live in the past and try to get his father to apologize and acknowledge his past wrongs. The dinner scene continues to go sideways, with Frank continuing to yell, showing his inner broken child. But the rest of the family wants him to stop yelling. They basically cause a huge scene that everyone in the dinner/restaurant is just staring at them, and it's so chaotic. This is when Frank runs or walks to the church confessional where he talks to the priest and he talks about his childhood, basically the beginning of the episode. The priest tells Frank that he could either continue being angry or choose to forgive his father, but Frank leaves, saying that he will never forgive his father. Big Bill at some point moves into a big van in the neighborhood, and after this explosion and Frank being, I guess, the sour apple in the dinner, everyone decides to go to visit Big Bill's van and help him set it up and basically make it cozy, leaving Frank alone in the house. Due to the fact that everyone sees Big Bill as a nice old man, it is much harder for Frank to feel justified in his anger because all his yelling and screaming at Big Bill just look like an angry, aggressive adult yelling at a sweet old man, so it doesn't come across correctly. And it leads to people possibly questioning his trauma because they're wondering how can a sweet old man like that possibly do something as cruel as what Frank is describing. Big Bill's presence in the family encourages Frank to become the opposite of what he had been doing. It encourages Frank to be a more active father. It also eventually leads to Big Bill and Frank getting along, with them sharing a hug. Something so important to Frank because he never got it before. They start to bond and they truly act like father and son, a father and son who had been bonded by the hip or loved each other. But Sue sees through this and is somewhat annoyed by their newfound bonding because it's only surface level. And the children seem somewhat uncomfortable, particularly Bill, because by this time, Big Bill has shown some of his true colors to him, but everyone seems to put up with it because they believe that Frank and Big Bill getting along is really important. This bonding in the family culminates into everyone attending Maureen's play. Maureen had been practicing for her play and had invited her whole family to come watch her and support her, especially because, Frank was being more involved. She had a great grandfather. Her mom was really sweet and was about to give birth. Like, she just wanted the family, I guess, to have really nice bonding moment. But of course, it doesn't go well because the Murphys are kind of dysfunctional. So the family heads to Maureen's play, and Bill and Frank keep bonding over drinking and honestly nothing else. And that kind of makes Sue upset because they haven't talked about anything. They haven't talked about any of the trauma that Frank feels, and they haven't talked about anything that's actually surface level other than cars, beers, and TV. They finally get to Maureen's play, and the play is going well with everyone supporting Maureen. Eventually, the play has an intermission or a break session, and Frank and Bill talk. Frank talks and he applauds Big Bill for being a much better father, singing his praises and applauding him for encouraging Maureen's play performance, something he didn't do for him when he was younger. But rather than acknowledging Frank's hurt, Big Bill opts to dismiss it, saying that he was always encouraging of Frank. Again, of course, Frank disagrees, sharing his childhood memory and how Big Bill had encouraged him to get off the stage rather than stay on the stage. Sue urges him to stop because she understands that the conversation will not end well and it will in fact take away from Maureen and the play. Frank continuously reassures Big Bill that he can admit to his faults since they get along now. But Big Bill does not relent. Frank doesn't want his father to deny the pain that he's caused, and he wants his father to take accountability for what he had done. He's not asking for an apology. He just wants his father to admit the hurt and pain that he had caused. I honestly thought that Big Bill had dementia because of how adamant he was that he just didn't remember anything. I honestly want to believe that he just didn't remember anything and that he was just an old man whose memories were simply deteriorating. So there was nothing that Frank could have asked him to clear up. Like, he just wouldn't know. But the simple fact is that Big Bill does not see the error in his ways. He thinks that Frank was too sensitive and that he was just weaponizing all sorts of random things to get back at him. Big Bill then chooses to weaponize his age and his sweet old man appearance to continue to torment and gaslight his son, dismissing his trauma. Big Bill decides to call Frank Francine, the name that he had used to mock Frank during his childhood. And that infuriates Frank. The whole family looks sad, and the rest of the families watch in shock as Frank and Big Bill yell at one another. The intermission or the break is over, and everyone goes back to their seats except for Big Bill and Frank, who are still arguing at the back section of the play. Marine's big day on stage is overshadowed by her dysfunctional family. Big Bill torments Frank, trying to get him to punch him, and Frank eventually does. Big Bill falls into a bowl of punch and then hits the ground. People look in shock and horror as our old man tries to get up from the floor, and Marine cries and runs off the stage. Everyone looks at the Murphys, and Marine's big day is ruined. Sue lets Frank know that he needs to stop with the self-pity and that he had just embarrassed the family. Honestly, Big Bill was definitely wrong for tormenting Frank, but Frank, I believe, should have realized that his daughter's moment mattered more than anything, especially since he knew what it felt like to have his moment ruined. The important step to breaking this cycle is recognizing patterns. For example, Frank has told the story of his school play so many times that it's practically his origin myth, the second side to Dexter's original sin. He was excited, vulnerable, ready to be seen, and instead of applause, his father laughed, loudly and cruelly, turning Frank's joy into lifelong shame. Decades later, Maureen gets her own school play, her own chance to shine, but just like Frank, her big moment is upstage, not by laughter this time, but by chaos. Her father and grandfather erupt into a public shouting match, dragging years of pain into a room that was supposed to be hers. She doesn't get mocked, she gets forgotten. 2 different generations, 2 different stages, one identical message. Your feelings and your moment does not matter. That's the cycle. Frank swore that he would never become like his father, but in this moment when Marie needed him most, he became exactly that. Sue had been pregnant throughout season 4, and in episode 10, her water finally breaks, and she calls her neighbors for help, but all of them are literally so useless. It's actually so funny. So she decides to drive the broken down car and just like take herself to the hospital, but the car basically stops because it's not good and it needs to be fixed. Janet, one of my favorite characters in F is for Family, I know, she sees Sue and decides to help her get to a bus. And during this time, Frank is in Cleveland. He's out of town because him and Sue got into a fight and he decides to go to a work meeting out of town. But while he's there, he finds out that Sue is pregnant and has to take the plane back so that he can be there for the birth of his child because he hadn't been there for any of the other births of his children. During this whole dysfunctional get Sue to the hospital, get the family together to see the birth of the child, get the family together to take photos or be near the babies situation, Frank finally realizes that all the anger that he had been holding on to was because of his dad. Frank learns that his pent-up anger is because he hasn't forgiven his father. Although I don't necessarily believe that you need to forgive someone to let go of your anger, I do think that this is a good step for Frank to start figuring himself out. On the other hand, Big Bill was plotting on Frank. He wanted to come attack Frank for what had happened at the play, but after realizing that Frank wasn't home and that Sue was giving birth, he and the kids decide to go to the hospital, and the kids basically let Big Bill know that they saw what he did to their dad and that they saw how he was manipulating their dad and that they were very disappointed and disliked him. And that makes Big Bill think about his behavior. Rather than going home, Big Bill decides to go to the hospital's chapel where he confesses that he thought that he was raising his son right for the time, but now realizes that he really did mess up. And one of the nurses, this nurse has been through a lot throughout this episode, she comforts him and she makes him feel understood and basically gives him the support that he needs to, I guess, get closure with his son, his grandkids, and his family in general. Frank finally reaches the hospital and he looks for Sue's room. And while he was doing that, he stumbles upon the hospital chapel where Big Bill is. And Big Bill decides to apologize to Frank and admits that he had originally planned to beat him up with a tire iron. But after realizing that Sue was pregnant and after having a conversation with the kids, he's realized that he hasn't been a great father. But before Big Bill can truly apologize to Frank for what he has done, but he gets interrupted because he has to go see Sue. And he gives his father a look of understanding and he goes to see Sue. When he sees Sue, he promises to be a better husband and a better father and to do good by the new kid. Sue gives birth and the family bond over the new baby girl. But when Frank takes the baby to the chapel to meet Big Bill, he has a cardiac arrest caused by an aneurysm and he later passes away. I personally think that this ending is interesting because Big Bill never really gets to utter his apology, but in those last few moments, we see Frank understand what his father is coming from. Because again, Frank wasn't expecting an apology per se, he wanted an acknowledgement. And that moment in the chapel, I think Big Bill acknowledged his wrongs and he really saw that he really messed up and that getting along with his grandkids and his son mattered a lot to him. I mean, he's been lonely for the past 18 years. He was kicked out the house and he's been living alone. So he wants to have a family again and possibly wants to have a relationship with his son. Rather than coming at it correctly and understanding and acknowledging he really hurt Frank and his family when he was younger, he believes that what he did was right because at that time, that's what he believed. And he thought he was better than his father, who was horrible. So by that sense, he was good. But if, again, you're comparing trash to trash, you're comparing trash to trasher, of course, trash is going to look better than trasher, but it's still trash. So, my last topic is going to be about forgiveness. I think that this show really, I guess, emphasized subtle forgiveness or at least trying to understand what someone has done. But I think Big Bill does in fact die in peace. He sees his grandchild, his last grandchild at least, and he finally gets to have a proper moment with his son, although it could have gone further. He doesn't exactly say the word sorry. He said sorry the Big Bill way. So first off, I think it's important to treat children like humans, not pets. They are not your mini-me's who have no autonomy of their own. And if you are not prepared to have children different from you, then I personally think that you should not be having kids. If you are not able to discuss your problems without breaking down, beating, making yourself a victim, and being volatile to your kids, you should not be having kids. If you had a bad day, your kid is not supposed to magically understand that you had a bad day, nor are they supposed to be responsible for making you feel better. They are not your therapist or your friend. I mean, they can be your friend, maybe later on, but in those formative years, you are their parent, and I think there should be that boundary. Support and safety is so important for a child's development, and taking that away from them early on is just so evil. I'm not calling Big Bill evil because, again, he's a product of his time. I'm just explaining how those dynamics can go ahead to affect the children even into their adult lives. Big Bill's company went bankrupt and he basically lost everything, and he's having a horrible, I guess, life now. He's deciding to take it out on his family and his kids. That's extremely toxic and horrible because you shouldn't manifest the negativity that you have in your life onto other people because that's just horrible. It's just so bad. And you shouldn't expect your kids to be the ones to comfort you. It's good if they do,
but it's not their job. It's your job to comfort them because you're the parent, but it's not their job to comfort you. If they do that, that's great. Your kid is so emotionally intelligent. But if they don't, that's a kid. Like, what are you expecting? This show doesn't give easy answers. I don't think it necessarily preaches forgiveness or suggests that a single apology fixes all the years of pain. I think it asks a deeper question. Do you have to forgive someone who broke you? And what happens if you don't? Some parents, like Big Bill, choose to deny the trauma they cause. Sometimes it is in fact dementia, and other times it is selective amnesia. Others, like Frank, try to overcome it but pass it on unconsciously. Some hurt you and never say sorry, and some say sorry far too late. Frank did what he could with what he was given. So did Big Bill. But maybe now, with this new baby, the Murphys have a chance to break the cycle. And again, forgiveness doesn't always bring healing. Sometimes healing means accepting the pain, remembering it, and choosing to do better anyways. And sometimes that truly is enough. Maybe others need that extra push toward forgiving the person who wronged you, and others can just move on from it. Either way, I think people are justified and correct for dealing with their trauma in any way that they possibly can, that, I don't know, makes them like a better person or helps them to overcome as much as they can. I think no one is entitled to forgiveness and no one should be coerced into forgiving someone. Pushing someone to forgive before they are ready can actually be harmful. Some parents deny the trauma they've caused, some think cruelty is discipline, and some, like Big Bill, hide behind smiles, jokes, or old age. Forgiveness doesn't always mean healing. Sometimes healing comes from accepting the pain and choosing to grow in spite of it.